In my fried chicken recipe, there are 3 components: the chicken itself, then wet ingredients to make a marinade more flavorful, and dry ingredients to give the fried chicken a crispy crust we love. Here's my recipe that I built from ground up after a ton of testing, and let me take you through the key experiments I designed to discover how to make my fried chicken better, to get closer to answer one question I'm obsessed about: what makes fried chicken taste good? I got my crispy crust chicken using these 6 ways. Number 1. Use a mix of flour and starch for crunch and crispiness. 2. Balance the amount of liquid and ingredients in the batter. 3. Coat the chicken in a specific order, that is to dip into the batter first, then dry mix second. And the fried chicken comes out with a relatively rougher looking surface compared to just the batter only version. 4. Use dairy or aromatics in the marinade to enhance the crunchiness. 5. Fry at a moderate oil temperature. And 6. Double fry again to further dry out the crust to make it crispy and not soggy. Do all these 6 ways and you get a crispy max crust in fried chicken that's brain rattling. Let's break it down. The first ingredient I want to understand is which flour gives the crispiest crust that lasts the longest. Broadly, there are 2 categories: starches from plants and wheat-based flour from high protein to low protein. For each of them, I prepare a drumstick seasoned with 1% salt to make the most basic fried chicken here, by dry coating each of them with each flour. They all look white, but they have subtle differences between them. To give a fair test, I deep fried them for the same amount of time at the same oil temperature and kept them warm in an oven until every piece is ready to be tested at the same time. Here's a closer look at each sample, and more importantly, here's how they sound. Normally, I don't record sounds for my videos, but I think it's needed here to let you know what type of crispy chicken this is, as they are all crispy in their own way. I was expecting a golden brown crust for every one of them, but the starches look kind of off-white. I thought I did something wrong here, but I found out from the internet it's due to the browning of its protein content in flour, like how meat browns, while starches have no protein at all, so it remains white. After tasting them, the all-purpose flour, bread flour, and cake flour ones have the best crust, and I couldn't really taste any difference between them at all, so I don't mind using any of them. Although some people say that the lower protein content in cake flour makes a softer crust, but I didn't notice that at all. I don't recommend glutinous rice flour as it leaves behind a weird rice taste which tasted off, so we'll drop this from future tests. But overall, I like any of the wheat flour ones the most because it tastes more savory than any of the starches here because of the browning. However, the starches have a thinner crispy crust and is a little flaky also, but it lacks in flavor compared to the wheat flour. For a more crispy and flavorful crust, we need to make a batter by combining flour or starch with some liquid so that it can also hold other ingredients later on. But first, how much water should we add to make a batter, and how does the amount of water affect the crust? First, I added bit by bit to cornstarch and I thought I was starting to get a thick batter, but things started to get a little weird. It becomes very difficult to mix because the starch feels solid when you apply force, but slides away like a liquid when you let it be. Starch in some water seems to break a law of physics and people call it a non-Newtonian fluid. This happens when we mix about 3 parts starch to 2 parts water by weight, and it happens to all of the starches, but not to rice or wheat flour. In fact, we need a little more water for rice or wheat flour batter to flow like a normal thick liquid, because they don't have as much starch. But apparently this is a science experiment that many people did when they were a kid, but I don't recall doing any of it, so this is some childhood fun for me here. But anyway, the problem here is that this weird starchy thing is difficult to coat the chicken as it gets stuck in like quicksand, and it also doesn't stick on very well too. So I did my best to coat it, pinching and pasting this starchy thing onto the chicken and sent it to the deep fryer to see what happens. I also added more water to another sample, and when it's about 80% hydrated by weight, it loosens up into a decent batter which coats my fingers or the would-be fried chicken easily. Adding even more water makes a thinner coat that drips off easily. Notice how the batter leaves a different type of trail. So how much water is good? I was thinking a thicker coat would make a crispier crust, but I was wrong. Listen to this. The pasty batter looks good, but the crust turns out actually hard like cardboard. Turns out that our little childhood science experiment isn't quite edible. But the next one is actually decent, forming a crispy edible crust. The rest are too thin, barely any crispy crust at all. So I believe that a good amount of water to add to the batter for starch is about 80% hydration of the starch weight when it drips with a smooth trail but no droplets. Too much water and you barely get any crispy crust. Too little water and you get a cardboard crust. For rice flour or wheat flour, the starch content is not as much, so I need a little more water to make it drip smoothly. Otherwise, it would clump up like little bits of dry dough. After adding enough water bit by bit to form 3 liquid batters of various consistencies, here's how they sound. Too thick and you get a hard shell, but at least the hard shell from the rice flour this time has some air pockets in it, so it's edible, unlike the starchy non-Newtonian crust. I find that a thinner batter works out better here for a more crispy and less hard crust. For flour, too little water and you get a pasty batter that makes the crust doughy. But when it's just thin enough and the batter drips off the chicken easily, the result is crispier because the crust is thin enough. The pasty batter also causes another problem. See this cross-section of the crust on this doughy part that sticks to my teeth. So in short, I would use a thick batter for a starchy batter, but for a flour-based batter, I would try to get it thinner to achieve the crispiest crust. This is the amount of water I used for the crispiest crust in this context. Normally, when we make fried chicken, we have a batter to dip the chicken into and a dry mix to coat the battered chicken. So, which order of coating the chicken gives the crispiest crust? Should I batter the chicken first or coat it in dry flour first? Here's what I tried. Using just cornstarch only, I coated the chicken in it before sending it to the deep fryer. Another chicken goes into the Optimum cornstarch batter that we found earlier, and the third sample is a piece of chicken dipped in the batter first, then dry coated in cornstarch. For the last sample, I did it in reverse, dry starch first, then batter next. It becomes more difficult to batter this time as it starts to become a non-Newtonian fluid again due to the added starch. But anyway, here's how they sound. Turns out that the dry starch alone was flaky and almost had no crust at all, while the batter alone formed a thin crust with sparsely distributed crispy bits. The batter first, then dry starch second, gives the most satisfying crunch. It has many random crispy bits around a thin crispy crust and provides the most well-rounded crunch. While the chicken dusted in starch first, then battered second, formed a thicker uniform crust that was harder to bite into. I did it also for the rice and wheat flour and found similar results. So I'm convinced that for any starch or flour, battering first, then dusting in starch makes the most epic looking craggy fried chicken crust with randomly distributed crispy bits all around for the most satisfying bite. See for instance in America's Test Kitchen, where Julia batters a chicken directly and then sends it straight to a deep fryer, whereas in another one of their videos, Brian batters the chicken first and then coats it well into a dry flour mix before deep frying it, and the fried chicken comes out with a relatively rougher looking surface compared to just the batter only version. Consider another example by Made with Lau, where Daddy Lau made a wet batter only version and his fried chicken turned out with a smooth crust, whereas in another one of his videos, he marinated the chickens first and then coated with dry flour, and the result came out with a relatively rougher and more textured looking crust than just the wet batter alone. Now let's see if the Optimum batter and coating technique we found earlier changes anything about which is the best flour or starch for the longest lasting crispy chicken. I feel like all of the starches we tested earlier want a rematch, so I built upon what we learned earlier to compare them again. The starches are all crispy, but the crusts differ. The potato starch one is more flaky, while sweet potato starch has smaller crumbs. Cornstarch has bigger, harder crumbs, and tapioca starch also has medium flaky crumbs. Rice flour and wheat flour on the other hand give a denser, harder crumb. We came back and tried them at every 15 minutes interval, and they all get progressively less crispy and soggy over time. So I couldn't really tell here if there's a winning starch or flour, and after 60 minutes, the starches still have a little crisp at the edges while the rice and the wheat flour one harden, but they are still a little crispy like a biscuit. Nothing goes to waste at the end of the day to save the meat for another day. Now that we've understood each starch and flour, can we get a crispier crust by mixing starch and flour? And which flour should we use? To find out, I tried out each starch mixed equally with either rice flour or wheat flour to see what happens, and used the same batter first then flour technique. Clearly, if we want a more dramatic, craggy appearance, a wheat flour combo is better than a rice flour combo. Mixing in some of the starch does make the crunch a little lighter to bite and not as dense as what pure rice flour or wheat flour alone would be. In terms of crispiness, potato starch again has a more airy and light flaky feel, while sweet potato starch got soggy quickly. Cornstarch has a slightly harder bite, and tapioca starch is similar to potato starch in having a flaky texture. So, which mix gives the longest lasting crispy crust? Over time, these chickens grew less crispy, and by the 30 minutes mark, after it's out from the deep fryer, here's how they sound. None of these combos lasted any significantly longer than the other, as they all got soggy and less crispy over time. So to me, there is no clear winner of a starch here for the longest lasting crunch, but I would still mix in any of the starches to the flour to lighten the crust to give a more satisfying bite. In my view, time is a bigger determinant of how crispy fried chicken is. The fresher it is from the fryer, the crispier it is. But if I have to just choose one flour or starch, the GOAT, greatest of all time, all-purpose flour turns out to have the best flavor and color, and it gives also a decent crispy crust if I can eat it right away when hot. Because let's be honest, right? Who waits for fried chicken to cool before eating it? So what else can we use to make the crust crispier and to also get a browner and rougher looking fried chicken like KFC? The answer could be in the marinade. These are common dry ingredients used to season the flour or chicken using herbs, aromatics, and spices to bring more flavor. But I'm curious to see how each ingredient impacts the color of the crust. In this test, I'm using a mix of cornstarch and rice flour throughout since it's pale in color so that we can really observe what color do these ingredients give us on the crust. And I like to see these as an artist's palette of possible colors we can add to fried chicken. We can even mix and match them, but my favorite ones are onion with an addictive savoriness to it. And garlic and cumin powder also have that lovely pungent earthiness. But overall, the dried powder flavors are quite subtle and they don't really add any crunch or crispiness to the crust, but just a little more flavor and color. One related question from one of our viewers is that how much dry seasonings can we pack into the flour before it starts to seriously affect the color and taste? So to find out, I made a dry spice mix out of my favorite powders, and the flour mix becomes increasingly darker, and so did the chickens. After tasting them, I think the optimum amount for dried seasonings is about 10 to 15% of the flour weight. Anything less wouldn't really make an impact in terms of flavor, while going above that would make it really dark and too overpowering and bitter in taste than I like it to be. One more bonus dry ingredient is baking powder, which can enhance the crispiness of the crust. But how much baking powder should we add? Baking powder can enhance the browning because it raises the pH level and that speeds up the browning reaction. Because we only need just a little baking powder for a sample, I got some special help from this weighing scale that could weigh in 0.1 grams increments. So after deep frying using various percentages of baking powder, here's what we got. It seems like a little baking powder goes a long way. 0.5% tastes normal, while 1% is noticeably crunchier. I think 2% is where it tops out. Any more than that did not lead to any significant improvement in taste or texture. These values are similar to Kenji's experiments in his Korean fried chicken. He found that half a teaspoon of baking powder per cup of flour or cornstarch mix is about 2% by weight and is about as high as he could go before the bubbles rupture. And he's probably right about that, as I could also see the most bubbles at 2%. Since the dry ingredients we tested earlier didn't make the crust more crispy, except for baking powder, can we find any of these ingredients to make a fried chicken crust more crispy? I tried different types to see how it impacts color and texture of our fried chicken, starting with fresh ingredients like onions, garlic, or chilies blended into a paste. The reality is that these blended pastes do not coat the chicken very well, so I have to press them together with the flour to make it stick. Whereas for the liquid sauces like Tabasco, they coat the chicken very well, but it slides off very easily too. Other liquids like eggs or buttermilk are thicker and coat the chicken really well, so I would consider using them to hold the other ingredients together. Here is also a combination of dried ingredients and wet ingredients to see how they blend. To my surprise, some of these ingredients actually add more crunch to the crust. The fresh aromatics like garlic, chili, and onion impart flavors that are savory and addictive, whereas eggs reduce the crunch and make it chalky in texture, especially egg yolk. The sauces generally were neutral on crunch, while sugar and milk-based products also add a good amount of crunch and flavor. Mixing both wet and dry ingredients melts the flavor together, giving both crunch and fresh flavor notes from the fresh ingredients and also tongue-tingling joy from onion and garlic powders. So here are my key takeaways about whether to use fresh ingredients or dry ingredients to make the crust crispy good. Fresh ingredients generally taste stronger than the dried ones and add more crunch. Like for garlic powder, it's milder in flavor, while fresh garlic gives you more crunchy little bits of fried garlic in your crust. Onions also do the same and caramelize to give a nice brown color. Generally, I prefer the flavor from fresh ingredients, which take more time to peel and prepare, but it tastes better than their dried version. But since they don't coat the chicken very well, I would use yogurt or buttermilk, which add crunch too by the way, to blend together with my favorite ingredients and season with soy sauce and Shaoxing wine because I'm Asian, and a little Tabasco for the acidic balance. All the good things in one place. Keep tasting until it's well seasoned, and we got a nice marinade derived from every ingredient we tested so far to optimize crunch, color, and flavor of our fried chicken. For the best dry ingredients to make the crispiest crust, I still prefer to use a mix of all-purpose flour and cornstarch, but I'm using bread flour because I ran out of it already from all the tests. We'll try out different ratios later, and instead of leaving this flour mix plain, we might as well season it with a little dry seasoning. And I like onion powder for that addictive umami, garlic powder also for that fragrance, and paprika powder for its fruitiness. Set aside about half of the flour for dredging and hydrate the other half until it drips like a cross between our Optimum batter from earlier, since this is a mix of starch and flour. I'm just guessing the hydration amount here, so this is a beta version of my recipe and it will be further optimized later on. But for now, we have our setup to test out which oil temperature is ideal to fry this chicken, and we're going to need some help from a meat probe to monitor the internal meat and oil temperature. Oh, speaking of deep frying, after many hours of testing, my induction hob is fried too. So induction hob owners, beware, don't let it go too hot for too long. Luckily, my unit's warranty is still valid, but it's almost over, so I managed to get the circuit board replaced one more time. Anyway, when deep frying chicken, how hot should the oil temperature be to give the crispiest crust? I'm frying the chicken from my derived recipe so far at various oil temperatures ranging from 120 degrees Celsius to 180 degrees Celsius. At about 120, nothing seems to be happening except for a very slow bubbling. But at higher temperatures, the oil gets more vigorous as water escapes more rapidly. What I find interesting from the temperature charts is that regardless of the oil temperature, the core temperature rises at about the same rate, except for the 180 degrees oil. There is a bigger difference when it comes to the surface temperature, meaning the crust. It fries mostly at near 100 degrees Celsius, but in 180 degrees Celsius oil, the stove is slightly underpowered to keep up, but it's already hot enough to prove the point that it burns the crust at this temperature. With the aromatics in there, now it's starting to look like a good fried chicken. Crispiness wise, 120 is soggy and not crispy at all, while 140 degrees Celsius is crispy and perfect. For 160 degrees Celsius, it's also crispy, but it's starting to have a dark brown appearance. And 180 degrees Celsius is just burnt carbon. It smells like coffee and tastes bitter. But why do other recipes fry the chicken at 180 degrees Celsius or around 350 Fahrenheit, which didn't work for my fried chicken? To investigate further what is burning the crust, I dissected my recipe into 3 parts. Part 1 is just the dry mix with water, that is, cornstarch and bread flour equal parts seasoned with dried powders only. Part 2 is when I use buttermilk instead of water, and I also added some liquid seasonings like soy sauce and Chinese wine. We know that these ingredients add color already from our previous test, but this time we're frying at a higher temperature to see if they are causing it to burn. Part 3 is the same as Part 2, plus some fresh aromatics like garlic, onions and chilies, our favorite ingredients that add crunch. Before we discuss the results, check out this new external hob I got for high temperature deep frying. It's twin cooled by 2 fans underneath to prevent overheating, and it's a really loud but powerful hob. So now I could deep fry it at true 180 degrees Celsius oil. But first, fry them all at 140 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes, and here's how they look. After the second fry at 180 degrees Celsius, which drives the oil really crazy, you can see the steam escaping rapidly at first, but calms down after a few minutes. And then this is what we get. Again, this is just at 140 degrees Celsius for the first fry. Everything looks normal, but at the second fry at a higher temperature, it turns out that 180 degrees Celsius is only suitable if we are using just dry ingredients and no buttermilk or aromatics, as the color looks kind of borderline acceptable to me. To confirm that the aromatics are causing the crust to darken, I blended the aromatics with water and it also turned out dark and smoky. But as you can hear, I still want buttermilk and aromatics in my fried chicken because they add so much crunch and good flavor than just dried powders only. I would only deep fry the chicken the second time at 140 degrees Celsius range, which I found is already enough to get me the double fry effect of a crispier, crunchier crust. But does it make any difference if we use the same or higher oil temperature during the second fry? I start the chicken at 140 degrees Celsius first till it reaches the desired core temperature, then rest it in the open till completely cooled. After the chicken has rested about 2 hours later, look at how soft the crust became and it's easily pressed. So I fried again at a higher temperature at about 160 degrees to 170 degrees Celsius oil to drive out more moisture. Or also at the same 140 degrees Celsius the second time to see if that works too. Compared to the single fry, the double fry definitely has a crunchier and crispier crust, but it's also darker, harder, drier, and denser like a biscuit. Yet, I could still achieve the same double fry crust effect at just 140 degrees Celsius during the second fry without darkening the crust. So to retain the attractive golden brown color and still get a double fried effect, I believe it's worth doing the double fry for a crispier crust, and the sweet spot oil temperature range is about 140 degrees to 150 degrees Celsius for both the first and second fry. So what exactly is causing a double fried chicken to be crispier than a single fry? In theory, frying the chicken twice dehydrates the crust even more than just the first fry, thus promising a crispier crust. But why not just let the chicken fry in there for a good 15 minutes instead of splitting 10 minutes first and then 5 minutes after? Here's what I found. The single fry one is not as brown as the double fry one by a little bit. After tasting them, I find that the single fry is not as crunchy and hard as the double fry. The single fry also has a little softness underneath the crust compared to the double fry, which is crispy and crunchy all the way through. I think the difference here is due to the rest time, which allows the crust to fully reabsorb moisture from the surrounding until it reaches an equilibrium and turns spongy. Then when deep fried the second time, it becomes drier all the way through. Whereas for the single deep fry, even though it went through theoretically the same time and temperature, it did not have the same time for the moisture deep inside the crust to redistribute with the air, so it remains soggier than the double fry. That's just my guess, so if you're a thermodynamist or a food scientist, please let me know your thoughts. So how long do we have to wait after the first fry to do the second fry? Can we get the same effect with a shorter amount of rest? I varied the rest time to 1 hour or just 15 minutes and working backwards so I could try them all at the same time. Then after deep frying them at 140 degrees Celsius for 5 minutes, this is how they sound. After trying them, I couldn't really tell any difference between them. I also gave Natasha to try, and she also couldn't tell any difference in the crust between the 2 hour, 1 hour or 15 minutes rested double fried chicken. They are all as crispy and crunchy, so the good news is that we don't actually need to wait for the chicken to cool completely before refrying. Just about 15 minutes rest would do. But what if I freeze the chicken after it's fried? Would it make it better? Let's see if we can make our own convenient frozen product and compare it. The next day, I deep fried the frozen sample, and man, this is the most extreme test I've put the thermometer through, going from minus 17 degrees Celsius to 140 degrees Celsius in a flash. And it took about 17 minutes for the internal temperature to get up to temp. Unfortunately, I lost the data from the night before it froze, and I only have it now when I took it out from the freezer. After tasting it with a double fried chicken that rested for just 15 minutes, I was kind of disappointed with the frozen one because the longer frying time made the crust darker than I like it to be, and the meat was also drier and not as juicy as the control. So I guess that's the drawback for having frozen ready-made fried chicken that I could fry up anytime. Now that we've understood the basics of fried chicken, I turn to address the problems in my recipe. Remember this crust from our double fry experiment? I find that the crust is really hard, although crunchy, like a biscuit. So to fix that, I probe into 3 areas. I'll be looking at the marinade, or the batter, or the dry mix. First, for the marinade, I try to vary the amount of aromatics I add into the marinade, as we previously found it adds crunch, but maybe adding too much makes the crust too hard. I find that decreasing the amount of aromatics added to the batter didn't really make a difference to the crunchiness. Every chicken here is still as hard and crunchy. Furthermore, Natasha said that the ones with lesser aromatics like the 20% or the 40% one did not taste as good as the 80% one. And in fact, the 20% or the 40% one tastes similar. So this suggests that the dried powders are probably driving more of the flavor at that point because I kept it constant at 10% of the flour weight. But when I doubled the amount of aromatics, the crust got a little too crunchy. It's crazy how crispy and crunchy 160% aromatics is as your teeth crushes through the crust, sending rapid vibrations to your head as you bite through. So I thinned out the batter furthermore and it's still as crazy crunchy. So I believe too much aromatics could make the crust overly hard and crunchy. And I feel that the optimum amount of aromatics in the batter is about 80% of the buttermilk weight to not compromise on the flavor. Next, to make my fried chicken more crispy like thin potato chips but less crunchy hard like raw carrots, I look at my recipe's batter hydration to try out different amounts of marinade to see if that would fix the crust that is too hard. Initially, I thought that for a 1:1 equal mix of starch and flour, I would need a proportionate amount of water, that is about 40 grams of water for a 34 grams of dry mix. But if I strictly followed this amount of marinade, clearly the batter is not hydrated enough. And it has to be because the various powders in the mix and aromatics soak up moisture in the batter, so I will need a lot more moisture to compensate for that. Otherwise, it becomes problematic to use too. Notice how the batter doesn't stick on very well and I have to paste it onto the chicken. So I tried out various percentage hydration of the batter and here's how they look. And it feels a little crazy that I needed the help of several kitchen timers to ensure that each fried chicken is double fried for the same time. It turns out that a wetter batter makes the crust less hard. Notice how the drier batter has a thicker shell instead of a crust, while the more hydrated ones are thinner. More importantly, a wetter batter also makes coating the chicken more easily. Because every fried chicken recipe out there has different ingredients, I think that the batter drip is a more universal guide to estimate how liquid the batter should be. Something about 240% to 300% that drips droplets like this should be good. According to my taste test, they yield the right level of crust thinness for more satisfying crunch. Finally, I tried different ratios of starch and flour to see which gives me the crispiest crust in my recipe. I've been fixing it at 1:1 cornstarch and bread flour all this while, so to see if we can get a better crust, I tried increasing the ratio from 1:1 to 3:1 cornstarch to bread flour, or even just cornstarch alone, and this is how they look. The cornstarch one didn't coat the chicken as well since I kept the batter hydration constant. So using what we learned earlier about optimum hydration, I decreased the batter hydration proportionately and now it coats better. So the test we did earlier was not in vain. Here's also with just pure bread flour for comparison. I really like how the equal ratio looks so epic and craggy, but the 3:1 cornstarch to bread flour ratio tones it down a little and makes the crust lighter and less brain rattling. The pure cornstarch is just too airy for my liking, while the pure flour has the OG fried chicken flavor, which has the densest, crunchiest, and the most flavor from all that browning. But overall, I would increase the ratio from 1:1 to 3:1 starch to flour to get a slightly more airy crust. We'll get lesser flavor from the flour, but we can make up for that with the aromatics and sauces in there. Now that I have balanced my recipe, I give every flour and starch a chance again to prove which gives the longest lasting crust. For this ratio of starch to flour, I substituted the starch for each of our earlier contestants again, and since I have everything out here, why not just combine all of them to see what happens, like everything all at once. Now with a full suite of ingredients, I can confirm that the sweet potato or tapioca starch and flour combo gives the best fried chicken I've ever made so far. It's crispy, a little flaky, light and crunchy, so I really like how it turned out. All of them still got soggy over time. After leaving it out here for an hour, here's how they sound. After 1 hour, everything all at once sounds good, but it has a mix of crispy, hard crust with a little soggy crust underneath. Starting with potato starch, it was the first to go soggy, while cornstarch grew harder, but rice flour became even harder and denser as expected. Previously with the starches alone, I felt there was no clear winner, but now with more ingredients like aromatics and buttermilk involved, tapioca or sweet potato starch remains the lightest, shattering kind of crunch even after 1 hour. Between the two, I like tapioca starch the most, so here is my updated recipe after including the key findings from optimizing each of the 3 parts of my recipe to ensure that the crust is crispy, crunchy, and not too hard. And all these chicken bones go to make a wonderful chicken stock after simmering overnight for soups. So far we've optimized the crust to be the crispiest, but every time I get into the meat, I feel that the inside is rather bland. Hence, I explore brining the chickens by using good old salt. Would it be as flavorful by just using salt, or does it really get better after soaking the chicken in a marinade overnight? The marinade already has salt in there, but I'm adding extra salt for the chicken. About 1% of the chicken weight is the typical amount. We can soak the chicken in our marinade to let the salt get into the meat slowly, or dry brine it by rubbing salt onto the chicken. Leave them overnight in the fridge to let salt and thyme do their magic. And the next day, I also prepare another sample where the chicken is seasoned either way for just 1 hour, and also one that is seasoned and used immediately as a control to see how much brining time do we really need. From a blind taste test, Natasha prefers the one soaked in a marinade overnight the most because she finds the meat has the most well-balanced garlicky aroma and savory flavors, whereas the one just dry brined overnight with salt tasted just more salty on the inside. I was quite surprised by this result because people claim that salt is the only molecule that is small enough to penetrate the meat, whereas the other flavor molecules are too big. But given enough time, I think the marinade has reacted with the chicken to improve the internal meat to be better than just salt alone. However, with just 1 hour of wet brining won't be enough and the meat still remains bland inside. But for the dry brining, just 1 hour is already enough to make the meat inside more flavorful and tasty, like slightly cured meat. But it does not have the aromatic depth of a chicken marinated in the wet marinade overnight. And because we need excess marinade to submerge the chickens in, there will be some leftovers with good stuff in there like aromatics and sauces. So I will use the leftovers to make soup by boiling the bones in them, while for the dry mix, I will make the batter a little at a time to reduce wastage. We also want some excess flour to dust the chickens in, but I will do that separately and top it up whenever I feel it's lacking so that I can keep the bulk dry and save it for the next time because unlike the marinade, this can keep well in dry storage for long. So far, I've been using just a chicken drumstick to do my tests, assuming it was the best cut, but let's now try fried chicken out of other cuts to decide which one we like the most. I have a whole chicken here and I'm separating into the common cuts. The bone-in options are the thigh separated from the drumstick and also the wing, and the boneless options are the tenderloin or the breast meat or a deboned leg meat. To test each cut at their best, I try to pull them out earlier from the oil so that the carryover cooking takes it up to slightly above the minimum safe temperature to keep the chicken juicy. Here's how long it took for each chicken part. It might be easier to view the results in a table, and bear in mind your results may differ due to many variables going on here like the starting temperature and the size of the cut. So always use a thermometer to be sure about food safety. Generally, if I pull the chicken out when the internal hits about 40 degrees Celsius, it warms up to about 65 to 68 degrees Celsius after carryover cooking, and that's a good temperature for white meat like breast meat or the fillet. The bigger the meat, the longer it's going to take, up to 12 minutes for the breast meat, or as quick as 3 minutes for the small, skinny tenderloin. And if I let the meat go to about 50 degrees Celsius, it carryover cooks to the 70s range for better flavor in dark meat. Regardless of the cut, it generally takes about 2 hours to cool back down to room temperature, except for the tiny tenderloin which took just about 1 hour, so that we can deep fry again for the maximum time without overcooking the internal meat. But as we learned earlier, it doesn't really improve the results if we wait around longer after the first fry to do the second fry. But this time, there is a catch, because we don't want the internal temperature to overcook, so the time it's going to spend in the second fry depends on how long the chicken is rested for. If rested till completely cool, then it takes about only 3 minutes to 6 minutes to get right back up to the temperature again, depending on the cut of meat. Or I guess about a minute or two for the second fry if you choose not to wait for the chickens to completely cool. But I want to maximize the time it fries in hot oil for the crispiest crust, so I will wait till it completely cools. Here's how each cut looks. The bigger the cut, the more surface area for a nice crust to form and the crispier it gets, like the big chicken breast or chicken thigh, which has a big surface area for this crust. The longer frying time for the bigger cuts also resulted in a crispier crust, while the wing and the tenderloin are only fried shortly to keep the meat juicy, hence the crust isn't as crispy. Listen to this. Cross-section wise, I was hoping to get the same juiciness as a poached chicken as it was fried to reach the same core temperature, but because deep frying is a hotter method of cooking and it's also double fried, so the meat tends to dry out more compared to when it's gently cooked in water, so the fried chicken meat isn't as juicy compared to poached chicken. I fry each cut at their best and let her try which fried chicken cut she likes most. She generally likes the breast meat the most, while my most preferred cut is the boneless thigh meat because it's bigger, juicier and more fun to eat without the leg bones. And I find it's also more flavorful compared to the breast meat, which is a big chunky white meat. The thinner part is slightly overdone, but the center is still pink and clean tasting, so it's less oily, that's why she likes it more. Second place for us is the tenderloin because it's small and easy to eat and it tastes really clean too. Third in place is the breast meat, followed by bone-in thigh and drumsticks because boneless meat is again better, and our least preferred cut in our view is the wing because the skin to meat ratio is not really where we like it to be, and I also encounter an abrupt change from lean meat on the drumlet to tender meat in the mid-wing, and then it's almost just skin and cartilage on the wing tip. After so many tests, I feel like I'm only scratching the surface of fried chicken here, pun intended, because there's still so much more to discover about different types of fried chicken around the world. But overall, I'm happy that I did this recipe test to develop my own recipe. We started out wondering which is the best flour or starch, and we didn't really find a real winner among the starches, as the good old wheat flour still turns out to give the best flavor and color. We can trade off some of that for more long-lasting crispiness when we add starch. Then we looked into the basics of batter hydration to find the optimum point where the crust is light and crispy. We also tried out different battering techniques and found that the wet batter to dry dusting gives the most crispy, craggy appearance. We searched for the ingredients that give us more flavor, color, and even extra crunchiness in the crust, and identified my favorite ingredients to go into the marinade. Bringing everything together, we studied the optimum oil temperature to get the best color without burning it, and also confirmed that double frying the chicken gives a crispier crust. We also did not need to wait that long in between the first fry and the second fry if we are using the leg cuts like drumstick or the boneless thigh meat, because they tend to give a juicier end result even if we cook it for longer at higher temperatures. Whereas if we are using breast meat, I would recommend waiting for it to cool down completely first before deep frying again to avoid overcooking it. I also resolved a problem in my recipe where the crust is too hard, but adjusting the amount of aromatics or increasing the batter hydration or swapping the starch for another led me to optimize the amounts that resolved the problem so that the crust is brittle enough to be crispy, crunchy, but not brain-rattling hard. If you've made it this far to the end of the video, please share with me your feedback, starting your comment with fried chicken engineering so I know you watched till the end. Let me know whether you'd like to see more of this recipe testing and experimental deep dives into food or something simpler. I'm still experimenting with my videos format, so your comments can really help me improve.